15. We still have Attorney at Law Martin George here with us to try as best as possible to sift through all of these different issues. Mr. George, just your perspective. I mean, 82 days to go to a general election. Are you anticipating some voter fatigue by the time we get around to September 7th?
Well, I'm fatigued already, honestly, you know, and I'm sure the population is already, you know, numbed by the overload.
Are they energized, or do the social media is alive and people bickering and rumor mongering?
You reach a point of diminishing returns, and there's a point where you reach of sensory overload, where people can just shut off and say, listen, I don't want to hear anything from anybody, basically, because it's just so many allegations, and we've only just begun.
Yes.
We are in for a long
There's a song from the 70s.
You know?
Another one from the 70s.
You know, so I mean, I think that, you know, the politicians have to be careful that they don't alienate and turn off potential voters who may not go to vote for the other side, but they may just stay away. They may just say, look, I don't want to have anything to do with any of you all.
Might that not be even considered a strategy, in the sense that, and I know it sounds a little far-fetched, but this is the time when you have all kind of far-fetched sort of rumors floating around, that the idea might be that we need really our diehards to support us, and those who are on the borderline, or those who have chosen not to vote, are really the ones who may likely vote against us. So the better they stay away.
But that's a risky strategy for either of the major parties to adopt, because they both need to have some cross-border appeal, particularly in the marginal constituencies. So I wouldn't recommend that. As I say, I don't have the foggiest idea how the mind of a politician works, but I mean, the point is, I couldn't see that being a viable strategy, given the fact that you need to have some cross-border support.
And just returning to the police and this whole matter, and whether or not the government or the individuals concerned could have handled it a lot in a more frank and straightforward manner, and could have dissipated this a long time ago. But from the whole question of the credibility of the police and the police service, doesn't this come across as just another example of either incompetence or an unwillingness to provide information freely and openly to the public?
Well, I wouldn't want to add to the obvious, you know, agony that is being experienced by the police service at this point. But all I will say, Fazir, is that it certainly does not inspire public confidence. It does nothing to boost that. And you see, I think it's the way we manage things that really brings about the result that you get. So in other words, if it were that this had been managed better from the get-go, then we would never be in this imbroglio at present. If you recall, when President Obama was running for office, he came out freely and admitted, look, in his earlier days, he did experiment with marijuana, he did smoke marijuana. So he took up front and he made it clear, and, you know, people dealt with it and they moved on. And I think similarly in this scenario, had it been that, you know, in fact, it would have been a very nice spin to put on it to indicate, look, there's been an alleged security breach, and therefore you're going to beef up the security at the Prime Minister's residence because this substance was found, and you put an end to the story. But unfortunately, it appears, and I think it really was a PR disaster. That's the whole point. And I think it was a PR decision that, look, we are not going to say anything about it. And of course, persons who knew about it, they can store that in their memories and later on reveal it as occurred in the circumstance.
Or record it.
Or record it, yes.
And what about the legality of that? Can there be charges laid for someone who might have known about an illegal act or a possible illegal act and chose to stay quiet about it?
Well, the point is, it's different if you are, you know, charged or found guilty of attempting to pervert the course of justice. If, however, you are not the person who had any direct responsibility for moving it forward, instituting charges, then your knowledge and your silence doesn't really implicate you in any way. But of course, we have to consider the circumstances as to whether there was any movement forward with the matter by the police service, or whether there were instructions, and this is where it can become a criminal issue. If there were instructions to quote-unquote, bury the evidence and not take it further, and if those instructions were complied with, then, of course, that's a different issue. We had, if you recall, the issue with the Bajan fishermen in Tobago, where apparently instructions were given
to let them go.
Thank you. You see? So that's what I'm talking about, where you have a direct interference. That's a different
So just
issue.
so we could understand, if I see somebody kill a man and they don't call me as a witness for any reason, and it comes up 5 years later that I actually saw everything that happened, but I was under no compulsion to reveal it, you can't charge me?
Nothing at all. Nothing at all. You have absolutely no obligation. And
just very quickly before we conclude, Mr. John, we do appreciate you joining us to offer some legal perspective on some of these issues, and even a broader perspective as well. Is there something as far as legal processes within the police service that makes these seemingly straightforward matters so cumbersome, so tedious, and so long-winded?
Well, the thing is, I would think that if people would simply follow the procedures, practices, and protocols which are established, and the police service has basically documented in several ways the things that must be done. They have their standing orders, their regulations, things which clearly identify, okay, if this exhibit is brought in, then it must be logged in the station diary. There must be, so whoever's in charge of the station must be aware of what was brought in. Then, of course, there's the question, well, okay, you detail further investigations, then there must be a report as to what was the result. So these are the things that I think that ought to have been done. And, of course, well, maybe now that I understand an investigation is being launched, I mean, of course, very late after.
Late in the day.
Yeah, very late in the day, so I'm not sure what is going to come off that. But the point is, had those procedures been followed, then even the scenario where you had, as someone described it, egg on the face of the top brass of the service by saying, there's nothing, and then, of course, the next day having to reveal that, well, yes, we now know of something. I think that's where the system has not worked, but it's not because of the lack of procedural directives and guidelines. It's because of either interference, as I say, of which I don't have any knowledge, or persons simply not following the procedures.
As you say, you don't want to add to the anguish of the police service, being in the Police Service Commission specifically, but if there, and before we conclude, if there was one thing you could recommend, if there was one suggestion that you could make that would assist in what appears to be, from the outside, if it appears ultra-critical, bumbling and contradicting yourself and so many things. If there was one thing you could recommend, what would that be?
Well, it would be two things, Fizzy, and there are two recommendations that I've made repeatedly. We need to depoliticize the issue of national security. In other words, we must not have the national security apparatus under the direct and total control of politicians. It must be, we must set up a National Security Commission, which is like a statutory body, because at the end of the day, regardless for all their failings, our statutory bodies are what are supposed to really keep the ship of state. Yes, supposed to. All right. And by and large, over the years, we must be fair, they have done a fairly decent, a much better job than the politicians.
Okay, sure.
We must admit that.
So a separate body.
For national security. And therefore, have that National Security Commission. Therefore, you'll have two different things happening. You'll have, number one, long-term planning which can be consistent. So therefore, this folly that we see our politicians engaging in, I am ordering OPVs, you cancel the contract, and you ordering vessels which some are saying are supposed to perform the same function, but because I had ordered this, you cancel.
You don't want the credit, give them the credit.
Foolish, one-upmanship that we've seen from our politicians. If you have a National Security Commission with consistent policy, they can say, listen, for the good of the nation, regardless of your political allegiance, this is what we're going with, and that can be followed through. That's one. The second thing I've said repeatedly, and it has nothing to do with office personalities, but the office of Attorney General ought to be depoliticized in Trinidad and Tobago, because the difficulty we've had is we've seen situations where some of the office holders have tended to make it a personal political vehicle. And it ought not to be, because when you are Attorney General, you are Attorney General for all of Trinidad and Tobago. You are not Attorney General for a political party.
Mr. George, as always, good to get your perspective. Thanks very much.